And this, my mother said, pointing right at me while I poured her wine, is just our housekeeper's niece. She's filling in tonight. She did not even look me in the eye. She just snapped her fingers near my face. Faster. And keep your head down. The help shouldn't distract from the business. I stood there in a cheap black server's uniform and a paper mask, pouring a $500 bottle of wine for my own parents and sister in my childhood dining room. They were not just ignoring me. They had completely erased me. To the wealthy lawyer sitting across the table, I was a stranger. To my family, I was just a prop they could use to look rich. But as I refilled the lawyer's glass, he gave me a tiny, almost invisible nod. My family saw a servant. We saw a target. Before I tell you what they signed while I was pouring that wine behind a mask, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The kitchen door swung shut behind me, muting the laughter from the dining room. I leaned against the stainless steel counter, taking a breath that smelled of roasting garlic and expensive hypocrisy. My name is Nora. I am 28 years old. To the people in that dining room, I am a failed consultant who moved back home because I couldn't hack it in the real world. To the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission, I am the majority shareholder of a distressed debt fund that specializes in acquiring toxic assets. And right now, the most toxic asset I owned was sitting in the other room, drinking vintage Bordeaux and lying through her teeth. Isabel wasn't just my sister. She was a sinkhole. At 31, she was the CEO of Lumina, a tech startup that had burned through $4 million of venture capital in 18 months without producing a single working product. She spent money on branding, on parties, on image consulting, but she forgot to spend it on compliance. Now, the SEC was circling. She was facing an audit that would expose everything: the embezzlement, the inflated user numbers, the fraud. Tonight was her Hail Mary. She thought she was meeting Mr. Sterling to sell her company to a mystery investor who saw potential in her vision. She thought this buyout would pay off her debts and keep her out of prison. And my parents? Robert and Ellen weren't just innocent bystanders. They were the architects of this disaster. They had drained their 401ks to keep Isabel's illusion afloat. 6 months ago, when Isabel needed bridge capital for a PR campaign, they didn't just ask me for help. They guilted me into selling my car, a reliable sedan I needed for work, and gave the proceeds to her. Family sacrifices for family, my father had said, taking the check from my hand without even looking me in the eye. I picked up the tray of appetizers, arranging the smoked salmon with mechanical precision. For years, I tried to understand why they treated me this way. Why was Isabel the golden idol and I the sacrificial lamb? It wasn't until I started auditing companies that I understood the family dynamic was no different from a corrupt corporation. It wasn't hate. It was consumption. A toxic family is a cannibalistic nest. They don't want the scapegoat to leave, they need her to stay. They need someone to be the failure so the golden child can shine brighter by comparison. They break your legs so they can complain to the neighbors that you can't walk. And then they demand you carry them on your back because family helps family. They forced me to serve tonight not because they couldn't afford a waiter, though they were broke, but because they needed to establish the hierarchy before the big deal. They needed me on my knees so Isabel could feel tall enough to negotiate. I looked at my reflection in the oven door. The black uniform, the mask. They thought they had broken me. They didn't realize that while they were playing house, I was buying the mortgage. I picked up the tray. It was time to go back out there. They were waiting for a savior to walk through the door and write them a check. They didn't realize the savior was already in the room, and she wasn't writing checks. She was collecting receipts. I walked back into the dining room carrying a heavy silver tray of roast duck. The smell of the rich glaze made my stomach turn. Not because I wasn't hungry, I hadn't eaten since breakfast, but because the air in the room was thick with lies. I moved around the table like a ghost. I placed the platter in the center, careful not to let the serving spoon clink against the china. My mother didn't acknowledge me, but as I leaned in to pour water into her crystal goblet, she drove her heel hard into my shin under the table. It was a sharp, practiced kick. A reminder. You are invisible. Do not mess this up. I didn't flinch. I just filled the glass and stepped back into the shadows near the sideboard, clasping my hands behind my back. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the performance. The user growth has been exponential, Isabel was saying, leaning forward, her eyes wide and earnest. She was good at this. She had charmed venture capitalists out of millions with that same look. We're currently sitting at 500,000 active monthly users, and our retention rate is industry-leading. I kept my face blank behind the mask. I knew the real numbers. I had seen the server logs. Lumina had maybe 3,000 active users, and half of them were bots her dev team had programmed to inflate the metrics. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, taking a sip of the wine I had poured. Impressive numbers, Miss Vance. And the revenue stream? Projected to triple by Q3. My father interjected, beaming like a proud emperor. Isabel has always had a mind for scalability. She's built this thing from the ground up with zero debt. Zero debt. I dug my fingernails into my palms. My father was sitting in a chair paid for by the debt he claimed didn't exist. He was eating food bought on credit cards that were maxed out. That's remarkable, Mr. Sterling said. His voice smooth. He turned a page in his notebook. And just for due diligence, are there any pending lawsuits? Intellectual property disputes? Employee grievances? The room went silent for a fraction of a second. This was the moment. This was the cliff. Isabel didn't even blink. None, she said, her voice steady. We run a very clean operation. Our legal standing is pristine. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to laugh. I knew for a fact that she had 3 wrongful termination suits pending and a vendor suing her for non-payment of server costs. In the past, I would have spoken up. I would have tried to save them from committing fraud. I would have been the frantic sister tugging at their sleeves, begging them to be honest, and they would have called me jealous. They would have told me I didn't understand business, but I wasn't that sister anymore. I had learned a hard lesson in the world of distressed assets. You never interrupt an enemy when they are making a mistake. This wasn't passivity. It was the predator's patience. If you wait by the river long enough, the bodies of your enemies will float by. But if you jump in the water to fight them, you drown together. I needed them to lie. I needed them to commit to the lie on the record. Every falsehood Isabel spoke was another bar in the cell I was building around her. Well, Mr. Sterling said, closing his notebook. That all sounds very promising. He looked up. For a brief second, his eyes met mine across the room. It was a microscopic movement. A slight dip of the chin. They took the bait. I think we're ready to move forward, Sterling said. The investor is eager to close tonight. Isabel let out a breath she'd been holding. My mother clapped her hands together in delight. They thought they had won. They thought they had charmed the money out of the sky one last time. I stepped forward to clear the appetizer plates. My mother grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. More wine, she hissed, smiling fake sweetly at Mr. Sterling while she crushed my pulse point. Keep the glasses full. Yes, ma'am, I whispered. I poured the wine. I let them drink to their victory. They were celebrating a rescue. I was celebrating a capture. Mr. Sterling waited until the last of the duck had been cleared away before he reached into his briefcase. The sound of the leather latch clicking open seemed to echo in the room like a gunshot. He pulled out a thick document bound in blue paper and slid it across the mahogany table toward my father. The purchase agreement, Sterling said, his voice devoid of emotion. The terms are exactly as we discussed. $8.5 million for the acquisition of all assets and intellectual property of Lumina Tech. Isabel let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She reached for a pen immediately, her hand shaking. She saw her salvation on that paper. She saw a future where she wasn't wearing an orange jumpsuit. However, Sterling said, placing a hand over the document, there is one final stipulation from the investor. My father frowned, putting down his wine glass. Stipulation? We agreed on the valuation. The valuation is based on the premise that the company is solvent, Sterling said smoothly. But given the volatility of the tech sector and the irregularities in the current audit, the investor requires a show of good faith. A reaffirmation of personal guarantee. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I stood by the kitchen door, my hands folded in front of my apron, watching the blood drain from my father's face. He knew what that meant. A personal guarantee? Robert asked, his voice tight. I already co-signed the initial business loan. This is a reaffirmation, Sterling corrected. It collateralizes your personal estate against the company's liabilities. Specifically, this property, he gestured to the room around us. The crystal chandelier, the silk drapes, the walls that had housed my childhood and my erasure. My father stiffened. He wasn't a fool. He was a man who had built a comfortable life by protecting his own interests. He reached into his pocket and put on his reading glasses. This puts the deed in escrow, he muttered, scanning the clause. If the deal doesn't close, or if there's a breach of warranty, I lose the house. That's too risky, Isabel. He started to push the paper back. For a second, I thought he might actually have a backbone. I thought he might prioritize his own survival over his golden child's ego. Mr. Sterling checked his watch. It is 9 p.m. Mr. Vance. The Asian markets open in 10 minutes. My client needs the liquidity proof uploaded by the opening bell to clear the funds. If this isn't signed and notarized by then, the deal is dead. 10 minutes? My mother gasped. That's unreasonable. That's business, Sterling said, leaning back. Take it or leave it. Isabel made a noise like a wounded animal. She grabbed my father's arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. She didn't care about his house. She didn't care about their retirement. She only saw the cliff edge she was standing on. "Dad," she whispered. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a scream. "If this falls through, the SEC audit starts Monday morning. They will look at the books. They will see the missing money." She leaned closer, her voice trembling with terrified narcissism. "Do you want to visit me in federal prison, Dad? Do you want to see my mugshot on the news?" It wasn't love that moved him. It was fear. It was the terror of scandal, of his friends at the country club knowing his perfect daughter was a fraud. He looked at my mother. She gave a small, terrified nod. They would rather be homeless than humiliated. "Fine," Robert said. His hand shook as he took the pen. He signed. Then my mother signed. They didn't look at the clauses. They didn't see the trap door opening beneath their feet. They literally bet the roof over their heads on a lie, believing that money would rain from the sky to save them. I watched the ink dry. It glistened under the chandelier light. That signature wasn't just a contract. It was a confession. They had just signed away their sanctuary to protect a criminal. Mr. Sterling took the document, checked the signatures, and placed it back in his briefcase. He locked the latch. "Done," he said. I stepped forward. "I'll clear the table," I said softly. My mother waved a dismissive hand at me without looking. "Bring the tart, and be quick about it. We're celebrating." I walked into the kitchen. I didn't reach for the pear tart cooling on the counter. I reached for my bag. I took out the leather folder I had prepared 3 days ago. They wanted dessert. I was going to serve them reality. I walked back into the dining room. My footsteps were heavy, deliberate. I wasn't moving like a ghost anymore. I was moving like a landlord. My mother looked up, her face twisting into a scowl when she saw my empty hands. "Where is the tart?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "I told you to be quick. Mr. Sterling is a busy man." I didn't answer. I walked straight to the head of the table, standing directly between my parents. I looked down at Isabel, whose face was flushed with the high of her victory. She looked so smug, so safe. I didn't place a dessert plate in front of her. Instead, I dropped the black leather folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy, flat thud that rattled the silverware. The room went dead silent. "What are you doing?" Isabel asked, a nervous giggle bubbling up in her throat. "Did you drop the tart?" "God, Nora, you can't do anything right." I reached up behind my ears. I unhooked the loops of the cheap paper mask. I pulled it away from my face, letting it fall onto the table next to the contract. Then, I reached behind my back and untied the apron. I let it slide down my body, pooling on the floor like a shed skin. I took a deep breath. The air tasted different now. It tasted like oxygen, actually, I said, my voice ringing clear and cold in the silence. "I don't think we'll be having dessert. We need to discuss the default." My father stood up, his face reddening. "Nora, have you lost your mind? Put that apron back on and get into the kitchen before I—" "Sit down, Robert," Mr. Sterling said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The authority in his voice was absolute. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and turned to face me. He gave me a respectful nod, the kind you give to a peer, not a servant. "The floor is yours, Miss Vance," Sterling said. Isabel looked between us, her eyes wide and confused. "Mr. Sterling? Why are you talking to her? She's nobody. She is the investor," Sterling corrected her. I rested my hands on the back of my father's chair. "That's not entirely accurate," I said, looking straight into my sister's eyes. "I'm not an investor, Isabel. Investors buy equity. They buy a piece of the future. I run a distressed debt fund. I buy the past." I opened the leather folder. Inside wasn't a check. It was a stack of transfer documents, stamped and certified by the bank 3 days ago. "You defaulted on your commercial loans 6 months ago," I said, flat. "The bank was set to foreclose next week. They sold the debt to me for pennies just to clear it off their books. I own your loans, Isabel, every dollar of the $12.5 million. "That's a lie," she breathed, gripping the table. "You're broke. You sold your car." "I sold my car to pay for your vanity," I corrected. "My fund is fine." I tapped the blue document in the center of the table, ink still fresh. "And thanks to the personal guarantee you just signed," I said, looking at my parents. "I don't just own the company's assets. I own the collateral." My mother's hand flew to her throat. "What collateral?" I stared at the life they built while erasing me. "This house," I said. "I own this house. And since the company is insolvent, I'm calling the debt due. Now." The room snapped into chaos. My father slammed the table, spilling his wine across the cloth. "You can't do that," Robert bellowed. "I didn't read it, you tricked us." Isabel lunged, grabbing the contract and ripping at the signature page like destroying paper could erase reality. "It's not valid," she shrieked. "You're a fraud, Nora." I didn't move. I watched her like an auditor watching a crash. "Mr. Sterling," I said. "Already digitized and uploaded," Sterling replied without looking up. "The paper copy is ceremonial. The e-signature was verified the second your father's pen lifted." Isabel froze, torn paper limp in her hand. For the first time, she saw me not as a sister to bully but as a wall she couldn't climb. "Why?" she whispered, shaking. "I'm your sister, and I was your employee," I said. "Unpaid, undervalued, and based on the server logs I pulled while you bragged about your clean operation, I now own a company that inflated its user base by 400%. I stepped behind my mother, who was trembling like pearls could protect her. "You lied to the investor," I continued. "You claimed there were no pending lawsuits. That violates the material adverse effect clause. It voids the equity buyback and triggers the personal guarantee immediately." I leaned close to her ear. "You introduced me as the housekeeper's niece. Told me to keep my head down so the help wouldn't distract from business." I straightened. "Business is concluded. I faced my father. Because I own the debt and you pledged this house to cover it, I'm foreclosing. You have 30 days to vacate." My mother broke down. "This is our home. We raised you here." "You didn't raise me," I said. "You housed me and charged me for it with cruelty. Now I'm charging you back. Market rate." My father sagged like the air left him. But Isabel's eyes flicked to her purse, calculating. Her tears stopped instantly. "You think you've won?" she sneered, yanking out her phone. "You bought paper debt. That doesn't control me." My father reached for her, confused. "Isabel, what are you doing?" "I'm burning it down," she hissed. "I still have admin access. You want the company, Nora?" "Fine." She smiled, pure malice. "There's $200,000 left in liquidity. I'm wiring it to a Cayman Shell account right now. You'll own nothing but dust." My mother gasped. "Isabel?" "No. Watch me." She jabbed the screen. "Send." She waited for me to panic. I checked my watch. "I was hoping you'd do that," I said. Her smile cracked. She looked down again, then paled. She spun the phone around. A red warning flashed. "Error code 909. Transaction blocked. Assets frozen by senior creditor." "What did you do?" she screamed. "Why won't it go through?" I pulled out my own phone and opened the admin panel. "I didn't call the police yet," I said calmly. "I just turned off your tap." "You locked me out?" "I'm the senior secured creditor," I replied. "The second I acquired the debt, I flagged every account for AML monitoring. Any transfer over $10,000 triggers an automatic freeze and federal alert." The blood drained from my father's face. He understood the difference between failure and felony. "Isabel," he whispered, "did you just try to wire corporate money offshore?" She shook violently, phone slipping from her hand. I was moving it for safekeeping." "You attempted to dissipate assets during foreclosure," Sterling said, voice like a verdict. "And you did it in front of a witness." He raised his phone to dial, glancing at me for confirmation. I looked at Isabel, at the greed, the cruelty, the emptiness. I nodded. "Report it." Sterling spoke into the phone. "This is Arthur Sterling. I need to report an attempted wire fraud in progress at the Vance residence." Isabel crumpled into my mother's arms, wailing. "Mom, make her stop." But my mother couldn't stop anything. She was just a tenant in a house she no longer owned, holding a daughter who was no longer free. The police arrived quietly. No sirens, just procedure. Isabel walked past me like a ghost, escorted out, arrogance replaced by shock. My mother collapsed, sobbing. My father glared at me, shaking with rage. "You destroyed this family," he spat. "We're your blood." I paused at the doorway and looked at him for the last time. "You're right," I said. "Family doesn't treat their daughter like a servant. I didn't destroy this family, Dad. I just foreclosed on it." Outside, Sterling waited by the town car. "Miss Vance," he said softly, opening the door. "It's an honor to finally work with the boss." I got in. I checked my banking app, my balance lower than yesterday. Buying the debt cost millions. But in the assets column, the truth was clear. I owned the debt. I owned the house. I owned my freedom. On the seat beside me lay the black apron, the uniform of my humiliation. I rolled down the window and threw it into the night. I didn't look back. I looked forward at the city lights, at the future I bought with their greed. If you've ever had to buy your way out of a toxic family, tell your story below. You aren't alone.